As the passengers began to settle in and the plane slowly rose into the sky, Andres suddenly turned quietly, with childlike innocence, to Raul, who was completely absorbed in his phone. "You're beautiful, like my dad," he said quietly and confidently, with a smile on his face. Raul froze. He looked at the boy in surprise and his heart skipped a beat for a moment. He knew that small children often said such things, but Andres's words had affected him far more deeply than he could have expected. Maria, noticing this, quickly apologized. "I'm sorry, please, he says things like that sometimes. We didn't mean to offend you." Raul raised his hand to reassure her. His eyes still remained on Andres, and suddenly he felt something cold squeeze his chest. No, it's okay," he said quietly. "You're right. Do I really look like your dad?" he said with a smile, but his voice trembled, as if he was going through something personal. Andres looked at him curiously and nodded, his small eyes sparkling with naive confidence. "Yes, you're very handsome, like my dad. He always smiles like that when he comes home." Raul froze. He knew that these words from the little boy were not simple, they struck him deeper than one would expect from an innocent child. It reminded him of his own life, of how he had once dreamed of having a family but had lost that dream at some point. Maria noticed the change in Raul and felt her heart squeeze. She didn't know what else to say, but she could see that her son knew no bounds to his sincerity. "He lost his daddy many years ago," she said, trying to lighten the atmosphere somehow, but not knowing how best to talk about it. "My husband left when Andres was very young. And since then, I've been trying to be everything to him, both mom and dad. He really wants to have a daddy." Raul listened to her in silence, his heart responding to her words. He was silent for a long time before he said, "You are doing more than one can imagine. He sees everything in you, and that's wonderful." Raul looked at Andres, who was now concentrating on playing with the machine as if nothing had happened. He didn't even realize how much those words could touch a grown man. "You're right," Raul said, his eyes filled with tenderness. "You made his world so much brighter than it could have been without you." Maria felt her cheeks burn. She blushed, but her heart was filled with embarrassment as well as gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, but her voice trembled. "Sometimes it feels like I can't cope, but it's moments like these. They give me strength." Raul nodded quietly. There was something different in his eyes now, respect and perhaps regret. He felt like he was witnessing a small but important love story between a mother and her son. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin became less tense. Andres didn't seem to notice the depth of the conversation. He was engrossed in his toy again, and Maria and Raul sat silent, each in his own thoughts. But for both of them, this conversation was more than just a casual chat. It was a moment when two strangers, despite their differences, felt a connection based on something universal, love and care. Raul continued to look at little Andres, and his eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of sadness, but rather tears of gratitude, because he realized that despite all his mistakes and losses, he could still see the light in the world. And that light came from a little boy and his mother, who lived in a world full of love and hope. A few hours passed and the flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin was no longer so tense. After the conversation had died down a little, Raul looked at Andres again. The boy was sitting quietly, playing with his car, but his face was peaceful and happy, like a child who doesn't understand the complexities of adult life. And Maria seemed to relax a little, feeling that talking to this strange man was not as awkward as she had first thought. Raul looked at the woman again and decided to continue the conversation. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you're an amazing woman. I can't even imagine how hard it is to be a single mom in this situation." Maria looked up at him, somewhat surprised, but then her face softened. "I don't think I'm that amazing, it's just, life forces action. Andres is my raison d'etre. Everything I do for him, for his future." She exhaled, squeezing her hands together a little. "Sometimes it feels like I'm too tired, that everything is too hard, but then, moments like this give me strength." Raul listened to her in silence, his eyes gazing at her softly. He could see her face suddenly serious and her hands trembling a little. But despite this, he felt that her words were sincere. There was so much warmth and strength in them that his gaze became softer. You sound like someone who is fighting for something important. And you're right, people like you need to be supported. He paused, noticing the way her eyes moistened slightly. I know it's not easy. I don't know what it's like to be in your situation, but I know how important it is to be there for those you care about. Maria nodded silently, her chest tightening a little with emotion. She felt her heart grow lighter at those words. Sometimes it seems like everyone around you tells you to be strong and not show weakness, but it's really hard. You sometimes think you're alone, that there's no one to support you. She smiled a little, but there was bitterness in her voice. But when you hear such words from a stranger, it's like a breath of fresh air. Raul couldn't help but notice how she tried to hold back her emotions. He could sense how hard it was for her to be in this role, a strong and caring mother, and how easy it would be for her to break down if it weren't for her love for her son. You're not alone, he said, his voice soft and confident. We may not know each other, but I think sometimes it's important just to hear that you're not alone, that others see your struggle and appreciate it. Maria turned her head and looked at Raul, and though she still felt a little uncomfortable, there was something new in her eyes: gratitude. Thank you, Raul. I didn't even know how to say it, she said, her voice trembling. You probably don't understand, but your words matter. Even if you were just being polite, it really matters to me. Raul tilted his head slightly, and his eyes became even softer. I'm glad I can help. It's not just words. I think you deserve support and respect, and you're not alone, believe me. He looked at Andres, who meanwhile had already fallen asleep with the typewriter in his hands. You're a strong woman, Maria. And your son, he's very happy with you. You give him everything he needs. Maria looked at her son and felt her heart fill with pride. She looked at Raul, and in that moment, despite all the fatigue and difficulties, she felt gratitude and warm respect for this man who had offered her such sincere support without any expectation. He really is my meaning, she said, and there was something warm and tender in her eyes. He's the only thing I have. Raul, seeing this sincerity, could not contain his emotions. Tears glistened in his eyes, and he felt his heart fill not only with regret, but also with a strange sense of peace. I believe you will do everything for his future, he said quietly, resolutely. And he'll be proud of you, I'm sure, when you both look back. You're giving him more than just care. You're giving him love, and that's the most important thing. Maria exhaled, her shoulders relaxed, and despite her hardships, she felt her world, if only for a moment, become a little lighter. Thank you, Raul. I will remember those words. In that moment, she realized that life could bring not only heaviness and weariness, but also moments when someone else's words could warm the soul and give her the strength to move on. Raul was a stranger to her, but his support was more important than she could have imagined. And maybe it was meetings like this, short and unexpected, that were the best moments that kept her going. The passengers gradually began to fall asleep, and the air in the cabin became calmer. The engine noise and quiet conversations gradually faded away. Andres, lulled by the fatigue of the long journey, fell soundly asleep, hugging his toy car. Maria smiled quietly, looking at her son, who seemed so carefree at that moment. Raul noticed her scrutinizing the boy, and his gaze softened. He leaned back in his chair a little and picked up his laptop, but he still couldn't get rid of the thoughts that had been in his head since his conversation with Maria. He felt that this time the words were important, not just words of comfort, but real words of support that he genuinely wanted to say to her. But something else inside him wouldn't let go. Maybe it was the feeling of regret that he couldn't help her more. Maria noticed Raul looking at her quietly and felt a slight unease, but also gratitude. She took a deep breath, trying to calm down, and decided to speak again. You know, Raul, she began quietly, so as not to wake Andres. Sometimes I think I expect too much of myself. I try to be both mom and dad and friend to Andres. But there are days when I just don't know what to do and feel too alone. Raul, listening to her, felt his heart clench. He knew what it was to be alone, and even though his life was completely different, this moment of despair was familiar to him. He placed the laptop on the table in front of him, deciding that the most important thing right now was to talk to Maria. "You're not alone, Maria," he said with a soft but firm tone. "I understand how you feel. You think you need to be perfect, but no one can be perfect. Your efforts already speak volumes about how much you love your son. That's the most important thing." Maria wondered how much those words resonated with her own thoughts. Everything she did was for Andres, but she often doubted her ability to be a good enough mother. In that moment, she wanted to open her heart, to share her worries. "It's not just difficult," she continued, "but you have to sacrifice a lot of things. When I look at Andres, I see so much hope in his eyes. He doesn't realize that I can't always give him everything he wants. But he always looks at me with so much trust, and I can't let him down. I can't." Raul felt his chest tighten at those words. He knew it wasn't easy, and that Maria was really going through all of this alone. "You're strong, Maria," he said, looking into her eyes. "And Andres is proud of you, even if he doesn't understand everything you do. You give him everything he could ever need in life, love and support. That's more than anyone could ask for." Tears came to her eyes and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show her vulnerability. But this conversation made her feel relieved, as if the burden had let go a little. "You're right," she said, smiling slightly. "Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes you just need to hear it from another person to realize you're not alone." Raul, feeling his emotions heighten, paused and added, "You know, Maria, I lost touch with my family a few years ago. I was focused on my work, on my accomplishments, and everything else took a back seat. But now I realize how wrong I was. You and your son have reminded me that it's not just success and accomplishments that matter, but the love we can give." Maria looked at Raul a little surprised, sensing his genuine concern at her words. "I didn't know that, Raul. I think that you too, like me, sometimes forget what is important in life." Raul smiled, though there were still traces of emotion in his eyes that he didn't want to show. "Yes, sometimes we lose that perspective. But you remind me that it's important to be there for those we love." He was quiet for a moment and added, "It may be strange, but I'm glad I was there for you today." Maria felt her heart fill with gratitude. This conversation with Raul, a stranger to her, was so profound that she began to feel her world become a little brighter. "And I'm glad we talked, Raul," she said quietly, with genuine gratitude in her voice. "In that moment, you were not just a passenger, but a real person, someone who shared my worries." Raul nodded, something warm in his eyes. He felt that at least for a few minutes he had been able to be part of something more important than his own problems. Meanwhile, Andres woke up, stretching and yawning, and Maria turned back to her son, smiling. He looked up at her with a bright smile, and she gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Do you still want to be my hero, Mom?" Andres asked with genuine love in his eyes. "You will always be my hero, Andres," she replied, her voice full of tenderness. "You are my biggest hero." Raul watched them, and his heart overflowed with gratitude for this moment. He knew that he would never forget this conversation, which had given him a whole new perspective on life and the importance of simple moments filled with sincerity and love. The airplane continued on its way, and time stretched smoothly. The passengers, lulled by the monotonous hum of the engine, began to fall asleep, but the atmosphere between Maria and Raul remained unusually warm and sincere. Raul felt his heart fill with a whole new set of emotions, and his thoughts about his life began to overlap with what he had heard from Maria. He couldn't understand why this conversation had affected him so deeply, but there was more to it than just words of comfort. Perhaps it was her openness or honesty that reminded him that there are times in life when it's important to be present and not just fly by. Mary, noticing that her son was beginning to doze off again, leaned over slightly to adjust his blanket, which had slipped a little. She whispered softly, "Sleep, baby. It's going to be okay." Raul watched her actions with surprising attention, but his gaze was soft and kind. He noticed her gently covering her son, and his heart filled with warm gratitude for this moment. He was already realizing that his life might not be the same again. Some insignificant encounters that happen by chance can leave an indelible mark. Maria raised her eyes again and met his gaze. She felt a slight uneasiness. Even though her conversation with Raoul had been genuinely warm and sincere, she still couldn't shake the feeling of awkwardness. She wasn't ready to share all of this with a stranger, but she couldn't deny that his words had actually brought relief. "I apologize if I talk about myself a lot. It's probably not that interesting," she began, a little confused. Raoul smiled, his voice soft and confident. "Are you what, Maria? You don't have to apologize for your feelings. We all go through hardships, and sometimes you just have to talk about them so you don't feel alone." He paused so she could feel how sincere his words were. "You've given me a lot to think about. I'm actually grateful that we've talked. You've reminded me what happens when you don't dwell only on yourself." Maria raised her eyebrows a little. She hadn't expected her words to have such an effect on Raoul. "Me?" she asked in surprise. "Are you serious?" "Yes, I am serious," he replied with a slight laugh. "Sometimes it's important to remember that things aren't as bad as they seem. Being around those who matter to you can make a huge difference." Maria reflected on his words. Her life was centered on making sure her son had everything he needed, and she often forgot how important it was to just be there for him and support him, not just deal with the day-to-day problems. "You know," she said with a smile, "you're very wise for a man I just met." Raoul laughed. "I'm the one who's grateful. Just don't think everything has to be perfect. Your son already sees you as a hero in every step you take. That's the most important thing." At that moment Andres woke up, stretching slightly, and Maria gently rubbed his head. "How are you, little one?" she asked with warm concern. Andres looked at her with a clear but slightly sleepy look, and then, as soon as his eyes met Raoul's, he immediately smiled. "Are you around again, uncle?" he asked with genuine interest. Raoul smiled again and leaned forward a little. "Yes, I'm with you. Hello, Andres. How are you feeling?" The boy looked at him curiously. "I'm good, uncle. You're as handsome as my dad." Raoul felt his chest tighten, and his eyes became a little clouded with emotion. He couldn't say a word, only smiled. He thought about his own past, how he had lost his family, and how important it was for Andres to feel love, even if his real father wasn't around. Maria, seeing the way Raoul reacted to Andres' words, felt that this moment was important not only for her son, but for Raoul as well. It was some invisible connection that had sprung up between them, and she couldn't explain exactly what it meant. But it was a moment of warmth that could be felt even in this simple conversation. "Thank you, Andres. You're a good boy too." Raoul said it with such sincerity that Maria felt her heart fill with gratitude for this meeting. "Are you our friend, Uncle Raoul?" Andres suddenly asked, his small eyes earnestly trying to understand why this man always smiled when he looked at them. Raoul thought for a moment, and then answered with a light laugh. "I think, yes, I am your friend, Andres. We all help each other. You know that friends are always there for each other." Maria felt her heart fill with lightness. It was the moment when she realized that despite all the difficulties, life can bring unexpected joys, moments when even a stranger can become part of her life and her son's life. As the plane continued on its way, Maria and Raoul spoke no more. They both realized that some small but important moment had happened between them that had left their souls light and warm. No matter how much time they spent in that cabin, their lives would never be the same again. And when they finally landed, Maria and Andres stood up, getting ready to leave the plane, and Raoul, feeling that he was not just a passenger on this flight, said, "Take care of yourself, Maria. You are strong. And remember, you are not alone." Maria looked into his eyes, and her voice was full of gratitude. "Thank you, Raoul. You're not alone either. We all probably meet in life for a reason." With these words, she took her son's hand and left the plane with a smile, and Raoul remained seated, feeling that some important stage in his life had just been completed. When Maria and Andres got off the plane, Raoul sat in his seat for a few minutes, thinking. He could still feel in his heart the words he had said to her, and how that seemingly random incident had actually changed his perception of life. He stood up, gathered his things and headed for the exit, but before he got off, he stopped and looked around at the empty row of seats left in the cabin. His gaze went back to the words he'd said to Maria, and he suddenly realized that they weren't just polite phrases. Raul realized that it was moments like these, when we share our vulnerability and genuine feelings, that could be the very points where destinies intersect. Maria and Andres walked through the exit, and without expecting it, she felt her shoulders relax and the heaviness in her chest let go a little. The flight was over, but despite everything, they felt like they had started to move on despite the difficulties. "Mom, will we be home soon?" Andres asked, rubbing her arm. Maria looked at her son and smiled. "Yes, soon, dear. We'll be home soon." She paused for a moment to look at her reflection in the mirror again. She felt her face become calmer, as if Raul, his words, had helped her realize that she was not alone, that there were times when you could be weak and still find the strength to move forward. Raul, meanwhile, was about to go out into the city, but suddenly his gaze stopped again. In the distance, at the exit, he saw Maria and her son approaching the cab stand. He felt something inside him keep him on his toes, that he had to take another step. Without thinking, Raul walked towards the exit, passing the crowd of people. He was almost to the counter where Maria was standing with Andres. Raul slowed his step, feeling his heart clench again, but at that moment he gathered his wits and walked determinedly towards them. "Maria," he said, a little embarrassed, but with a sincere expression on his face. "I'd like to help you. If you need anything, maybe you can call me, I don't know, just if you need support." Maria turned and noticed him immediately, looking at him in surprise. "Roy, I don't know what to say." Her voice trembled. "Do you really want to help?" "I can't even imagine what that would look like." Raul smiled and took a step closer. "I think that sometimes help doesn't always have to be something big. Sometimes it's just words, or that you're not alone in your struggle. And yes, I want to help. If you need anything, even just to talk, I'm there for you." Maria stared into his eyes for a long moment, feeling her heart fill with gratitude. She wasn't sure she should accept this help, but there was a lightness in her soul that she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was just that this moment and these words were a gift to her. "I don't know, Raul," she said, hesitating a little. "It's so sudden. But maybe you're right. Sometimes it's important to just talk. Maybe I can get in touch with you later." Raul nodded, not insisting, but his eyes still full of sincerity. "I'd be happy to help. You're a strong woman, Maria. And don't forget, you're not alone." Maria smiled, her gaze more confident than before. Raul's words gave her some inner resource she had been lacking lately. "Thank you, Raul. You don't know how much it means to me. The next time I'm having a hard time, I'll think about your words." He nodded silently and, without waiting for a response, headed for the exit, leaving them with Andres, who was heading home as before. And Maria, as she looked at him, felt her chest fill with lightness and her shoulders with a sudden new strength. Her day had begun with a feeling of loneliness and burden, but now, after this short conversation, everything seemed more possible. Maria and Andres got into a cab, and in that moment, driving through the streets of the city, she felt that her life might not be the same again. Raul reminded her that sometimes, even in the most difficult moments, it was important not only to fight, but to allow herself to accept help and support from others. "Mom, are you thinking something?" Andres asked, looking at her. "Yes," Maria answered, looking at her son with a soft smile. "I think everything will be fine and we'll manage. We always do." And even though they still had a long journey ahead of them, she knew that with each step, each day, she would grow stronger.